Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This video is a full presentation of a paper that I presented recently at a conference on peace, education and religions. It is titled "The Role of Progressive Islam in Overcoming Sunni-Shi'i Secterianism and Fostering Peace Education." So, the main aim of my presentation or lecture is to explain how progressive Muslims' approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition can provide us with important discursive and ideational tools from the perspective of the Islamic interpretative tradition in overcoming Sunni-Shi'i sectarianism and promoting Islamic ecumenism and therefore peace education in both Muslim majority and minority contexts. Now, before I go into the main part of my discussion, I would briefly like to situate progressive Muslim thought and progressive Islam in relation to the modern Islamic intellectual movements and to highlight some of the major theoreticians of this approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition. I will limit myself to the 20th century in terms of how far back I will go in history. That is not to say that this approach to the Islamic tradition did not exist earlier. Indeed, in my two monographs on the theory of progressive Islam that were published in 2011 and 2017 respectively, I have demonstrated in great length and have situated progressive Muslim thought in relation to the Islamic interpretative tradition from its very beginnings. So when we look at the major authorities associated with the theory of progressive Islam, as I have tried to theorize in my academic writings, in the 20th century, progressive Muslim thought can be associated with scholars such as Fazlur Rahman, Nur Kolish Majid, Ali Shariati, Alal Al-Fasi, Ibn Ashur, and similar scholars and public intellectuals. When it comes to the 21st century, progressive Muslim thought, as you can see, is associated with primarily Muslim academics, but also some clerics and public intellectuals around the globe. It is noteworthy that these scholars are both from from Sunni and Shi'i backgrounds, and there is a significant number of female Muslim scholars. Essentially, what is important for us to understand in relation to my presentation is that progressive Islam is one of the most significant transnational Islamic intellectual movements that also has a grassroots activist element in form of a number of NGOs that operate at a national but also transnational level. And in terms of its approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition, as you can see, the lowest common denominators that we can delineate and identify in relation to this approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition is based upon a number of considerations that are listed on this slide. And all of this comes from, as I said earlier on, my two monographs that I have published in relation to the theory of progressive Islam. I will talk about all of these specifically in relation to how they can help us in overcoming and transcending Sunni-Shi'i sectarianism. But let us start with the broader context, and from now on I will refer to some of my notes. So given the increase in Muslim sectarianism over the last decade or so, especially but not only in the Middle East, one will be forgiven for asking whether the idea of Muslims transcending the historical and religious Sunni-Shi'i divides today would ever be possible, even if one is of the opinion that this is highly desirable. The numerous recent events of sectarian or religiously inspired or justified violence and ongoing repression of many Muslim communities by other Muslims, both within and across sectarian divides, in many parts of Muslim majority world, which have resulted in, among other things, many lost lives, justify skepticism and lack of optimism in this respect. However, this rather grim picture ought not deter us from efforts to make the situation better, as problematic as it is. Put differently, the alternative of upholding the status quo is for many Muslims today no longer acceptable on both moral and theological grounds. Part of the solution is that the intellectual and the lived reality-based arguments for transcending Muslim sectarianism are already in place in form of what I here refer to as the theory of progressive Islam. The increased ecumenical spirit among various religious traditions and recognition of irreducible religious pluralism has come a long way recently, at least in theory. I say this as someone who has been active in interfaith dialogue, primarily between Abrahamic religions, for over 20 years at the grassroots level, as well as someone who has a keen academic interest in the topic. However, the ecumenical spirit at intra-Muslim level has not kept pace with these developments, and with a few exceptions, such as the Amman message, there are hardly any formal institutional efforts that have this aim. Many socio-political and economic challenges that contribute to sectarianism in the Muslim world are, at least in part, rooted in failures of Muslims to think about Islam and the Islamic intellectual tradition in new ways, ways that have potential to transcend the historical religio-doctrinal divides and associated animosities that have existed between Sunnis and Shi'is since the very inception of Islam. There is a great need for Muslims to develop alternative approaches to conceptualizing Islam that have the capacity to dislodge the dominant sectarian narratives that have historically led to and produced the current Sunni-Shi'i divides. This is where the theory and practice of progressive Islam or progressive Muslim thought comes into the picture. The theory of progressive Islam in my academic works draws upon both Sunni and Shi'i scholars. And conceptualizes and approaches the Islamic intellectual and cultural heritage in ways that at least place these into the periphery, if not entirely overcome the religio-doctrinal factors that have led to the formation of Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies as we know them today. It is crucial to draw attention to the fact that none of the pillars of progressive Islam are tied to the issues and doctrines on which traditional divides between Sunnis and Shi'is rest, namely that of the nature and location of religious authority, the views on the collective probity of Prophet Muhammad's companions, and the subsequent political theologies in the form of imamates and caliphates that have developed in both the Sunni and Shi'i versions. Furthermore, None of the specifically Sunni and Shi'i doctrines and beliefs I mentioned earlier that are constitutive of and fundamental to each of these traditions within Islam are normative from the perspective of the theory of progressive Islam. I define mainstream Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies as they have been defined in the Aman message, namely as forms of Islam which, and I quote, specifically recognize the validity of all 8 madhabs, legal schools, of Sunni, Shia, and Ibadi Islam, of traditional Islamic theology, Ash'arism, of Islamic mysticism, and of true Salafi thought, and came to a precise definition of who is a Muslim. End quote. These orthodoxies were laid around the 5th century of the Islamic calendar and continue to this day. The first point I would like to make is that progressive Islam does not view any of the doctrines and beliefs associated with specific Sunni and Shi'i doctrines as normative, but rather as purely historical. Moreover, the delineating features of progressive Islam, in relation to its own definition of itself, go beyond the parameters within which both Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies function epistemologically, hermeneutically, and methodologically. Therefore, progressive Islam does not only transcend the limits of Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies in this sense, but it does so without compromising on any of its own fundamental premises or pillars. So what is that first delineating feature or pillar of progressive Islam that can help overcome Sunni-Shi'i sectarianism? I refer to it as creative, critical, and innovative thought based on epistemological openness and methodological fluidity. What do I mean by that? This aspect of the theory of progressive Islam is that its exponents do not subscribe to tradition versus modernity, secularism versus religion, or to simplistic generalizations such as modernity equals Western or Judeo-Christian intellectual or civilizational tradition. Therefore, the theoretical architects of progressive Islam are engaged in permanent dialogue with the progressive agendas of other cultures, drawing inspiration from movements such as liberation theology, feminism, and secular humanism, to name but a few. Importantly, this aspect of progressive Muslim thought enables it to escape mainstream Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies, interpretations of the sacred past, which are constantly being imposed on their contemporary respective believers as non-negotiable elements of what it means to be a Sunni or a Shi'i. Progressive Muslim thought does not a priori privilege the sacred past in any of these ways, or at all. Moreover, progressive Muslim thought is radically open to new ideas and reconceptualizations of the inherited intellectual and cultural heritage, the Turath, that they can creatively and seemingly integrate into it and thereby creatively yet authentically transform it. Now let's look at the second element of the theory of progressive Islam and how it can help transcend the religio-doctrinal divides between Sunnis and Shi'is. I refer to it as historicist and contextualist approaches to Islamic theology and doctrines. Progressive Muslim scholars seek to rediscover and build further on historicist and contextualist approaches to Islamic theology as they pertain to the concept of revelation itself, scriptural reasoning and its methodology, and subsequent development of various forms of Islamic theologies, doctrines, and sectarian soteriologies. All of these are viewed as byproducts of historical processes that are continually reappropriated by various stakeholders and actors, both religious and political. Hence, all these aspects of Islamic belief especially those that are associated with sectarian soteriologies of Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies, are not considered as final, but are subject to continuous revision and critique. Moreover, progressive Muslim theology has many affinities with process theology, associated with scholars such as Hartshorne, John Cobb, David Griffin, and is indeed a form of Islamic process theology that moves away from classical theistic views of God and God's relationship with the cosmos and the entire creation. In this sense, Islamic process theology is grounded in theories of revelation and religious experience emphasized by Islamic scholars such as Ibn al-Arabi, Muhammad Iqbal, Nasir Abu Zaid, and Abdul Karim Surush, who emphasize the ideas of process and centrality of religious experience as contingent and dynamic. A human rights-based approach to the Islamic tradition in the theory of progressive Islam is another facet of progressive Islam that can help overcome the Sunni-Shi'i historical and religio-doctrinal divides. As I mentioned previously, both Sunni and Shi'i contemporary orthodoxies, in terms of their approach to what constitutes valid knowledge and how to arrive at it, are pre-modern, as there are respective approaches concerning the concept of turath and their theological worldviews pertaining to the question of nature of God and God's relationship with the universe and its creation. Being epistemologically pre-modern has caused a variety of tensions between these orthodoxies and contemporary human rights schemes, including in the area of how human dignity and human rights have been conceptualized. Both Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies, in relation to their view of the human being, contain a set of ethical, moral, and legal rights and responsibilities that differentiate individuals on the basis of their religious belonging, in addition to gender and social class, privileging those that belong to their version of Islam. As such, as argued by scholars such as Sakadina and An-Na'im, they are incompatible with modern human rights scheme paradigms. Progressive Muslim thought, on the other hand, in terms of how it approaches the turath, is epistemologically modern and is based on what Sheila Ben Habib, a significant political theorist of Jewish Turkish background, teaching at Yale, terms a weak form of postmodernism. In tune with the historicist and contextualist approaches that I talked about earlier, progressive Muslim scholars such as Sakadina, who comes from originally from a Shi'i background, and An-Na'im, who comes from a Sunni background, approach the issue of compatibility or the relationship between modern human rights discourse and the Islamic tradition by placing both in a historical perspective. This historicist methodology is partly based on a particular conceptualization of divine ontology, whose central tenets are justice and mercy. These values are considered to be sources of universal moral values that are to be extended to and applicable equally to all of humanity, regardless of their religion or gender. This argument, in turn, is underpinned by the premise, to which progressive Muslim thought subscribes, that each human being is considered a unique creation of God having equal dignity, moral worth, and moral agency, irrespective of their religious belonging. Hence, each individual and the communities that are comprised of these individuals, including the political, is entitled to enjoy the same inalienable rights. Based on this approach to human rights, progressive Muslim scholars are able to provide the preliminary theoretical foundations for the process of weaving the ethos and the culture of modern human rights discourse into the theological, social, and cultural fabric of Muslim majority societies, and thereby transcend the limits of Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxy in this respect, including in the area of women and minority rights. Now, the next pillar of progressive Muslim thought that can help us in overcoming Sunni-Shi'i divides and promote Islamic ecumenism is that of Islamic liberation theology. For progressive Muslim theologians, such as Hassan Hanafi, Ashkar Ali Engineer, Farid Esak, and Shabbir Akhtar, the concept of revelation is not a primarily theocentric but anthropocentric concept, which brings humanity rather than God into the full historical limelight as a subject of study. Furthermore, the so-called 5 pillars of traditionalist Islam are considered as religious in their form but political in nature, as their content implies free will, freedom to act, responsibility for one's actions, and hence the need to establish justice and fight injustice. Moreover, the concept of Tawheed, which is usually understood as a theological concept describing divine unity as a central tenet of mainstream Islamic theology, is considered to be an action-oriented belief system which affirms emancipatory and liberatory practices of the entire humankind and resists oppression, tyranny, and injustice regardless of their origin. Progressive Muslim theology, unlike Sunni and to a lesser extent Shi'i orthodoxies, prioritizes orthopraxis over orthodoxy. In other words, the human and the human condition are central to this type of theology and not a commitment to a rigid set of beliefs and doctrines. And finally, affirmation of religious pluralism. Progressive Muslim theology embraces and even thrives on pluralism, diversity, and what is fundamental to all of it, namely uncertainty. Both mainstream Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies primarily confine salvation to Muslims only. Progressive Muslim scholars such as Abdul Karim Soroush and Farid Esak, on the other hand, theorize and affirm the normative validity of religious pluralism at the epistemological level and highlight the difference between religion as an abstract concept and that of religious knowledge as a tangible, messy, historical one. Furthermore, they acknowledge the inescapable pluralism at the level of understanding of religious texts, namely scriptural reasoning or hermeneutics. Finally, progressive Muslim scholars recognize pluralism at the level of religious experiences, which are viewed as contingent, dynamic, and constantly evolving. This affirmation of the idea that multiple religious traditions are capable of providing guidance that lead to salvation performs important functions in overall progressive Muslim thought. For instance, this affirmation forms the basis of how progressive Muslim thought conceptualizes the idea of human moral responsibility, to be just and humble. Religious and salvific pluralism are also viewed as essential preconditions, philosophically speaking, for understanding the true meaning of the human condition ontologically, that go well beyond the parameters of Sunni and Shi'i orthodoxies that are premised on various versions of the superiority of a believer over a non-believer logic. Now, going beyond theory, I believe that there is a critical mass of well-informed Muslims for whom the historical processes that have led to what today is known as Sunni and Shi'i Islam are not fundamental to how they view or relate to themselves as Muslims, myself included. Instead, their sense of Muslimness is underpinned by the kind of approaches to the faith I have outlined in my presentation that characterizes progressive Islam, which is less about theology, or one might say political theology, and more about developing a cosmopolitan, social justice-oriented Islam that has a strong ecumenical spirit, not just within the boundaries of a reified Islam, but across religious difference. It is my firm conviction that validating and supporting such an approach to Islam is sorely needed today for a host of reasons, for both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. That includes, but goes well beyond, the issue of sectarianism. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this was useful.